floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is great. So what I will do now is I will share the screen. You can see my face front and center. This is great. Let me do one final step. Yes, now you should be able to see my PowerPoint presentation as well. Is that the case?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So just a few technical arrangements, as always, with online events. Please let me know whenever you have issues with the sound or the connection. I will try to adjust accordingly. And of course, I'm aware that in the next 20 minutes or so, we have an opportunity to discuss things at a certain pace, and you still would like probably to ask me questions and answers. I have a very sophisticated name for my presentation, and that is Experience and Benefits of Setting Up Whistleblowing Systems in Lithuanian Institutions and Companies. And as it often goes with such titles, before you actually sit down and dig deeper and understand what is it that you will be saying, it can all be narrowed down to a much simpler message. My presentation really will be about one simple question, and that is, so you get the law on the protection of whistleblowers, and then what? What do you do next? The law is there, it's there on paper, it might look really great, but what is it that you have to do next yourself? And so my key message to you during the next 15 minutes will be that it's not about numbers. It's not about the number of cases you actually have every year presented to you and discussed publicly. It's about people. And what I mean about that is that at the end of the day, we should really first and foremost care about the safety of every single person who chooses to report an act of potential wrongdoing. And that is what my presentation will be about. And this is what I would very much like to discuss with you in the next quarter of an hour. As you know, in Lithuania, we have a relatively good-looking law on the protection of whistleblowers. You discussed that, I'm sure, with my colleagues from the Prosecutor General, Monica and Daria. We are in close cooperation with the team there, and we'll be doing a lot of exciting things, I'm sure. I will tell you about a couple of them in the next few minutes. But first and foremost, again, I would like to bring you to the this particular slide. And this slide is from the Ernst & Young's fraud survey of 2017. To my knowledge, this is the most recent piece of information on reporting channels in companies in the region. And what you can see here is that it is key to understand the dynamics of people reporting acts of potential wrongdoings when you think companies and when you think public sector institutions, because at the end of the day, what we see is that a lot of times people are not comfortable reporting about potential problems within their own working environments. So when individuals were asked whether they personally felt any pressure to withhold information or concerns about misconduct rather than report them to their senior management or their colleagues via a reporting hotlines, more than a half of the respondents in our region said that they actually had information about potential misconduct. They were concerned about certain issues at their working place. Pretty much the same number of people felt that they were experiencing pressure, direct or indirect, and they were not sure how to go about it. And what is really worrisome is that almost almost 2/3, perhaps that's too much, more than a half, chose not to report these concerns. And this, of course, is an issue. This is an issue because this basically shows that management of these particular organizations failed to take notice of something which probably could have been addressed at a much earlier instance and would not have to force people to take other steps, which they, as you will see in the next slide, usually then do. Because the same survey, the same piece of research also has an answer to another question. And that question is, well, if you're not reporting your suspicions internally, if you don't go and speak to your immediate manager, if you don't speak to your colleague, if you don't raise this issue within your hotline, where do you go? And what we see that is that most people would then go to a law enforcement agency. About half of them would go to a regulator. Some would go to media outlets, to journalists, some to NGOs, others to a competitor. And this, of course, poses a very big risk to those people who report potential acts of corruption, potential issues of abuse, any other, for instance, environmentally or work-related issues. And my question here is this what we really want our citizens to do? I would maintain that first and foremost, what we should be interested in once we have a law on the protection of whistleblowers is to make sure that it is embraced not only by the oversight authority or the monitoring agency in charge of the implementation of the law, but by the heads and those responsible in every single larger public sector and private sector institution, because the protection of whistleblowers starts there. It's not the courts where whistleblowers should first and foremost be protected. When we have those cases that we all speak about, I think we would probably agree that we are dealing with the consequences. We don't necessarily always address the reasons why we have those cases in place. People defend, people fight, people get fines, people lose their jobs, they need to reallocate, people's lives and livelihoods are at stake. And this is much more an indication of the failure of the system, and we take immediate measures then to protect those who have spoken up, but it doesn't really address the issues that need to be fixed within the system itself. So if that is the rationale that we approach the issue of the protection of whistleblowers with, you may ask, what do we do to actually make any further steps forward? So what we do is we try and make sure that we map out the actual compliance with various reporting standards when we speak about the largest institutions at hand. What we also do is we try to make sure that we have a very clear set of quantitative indicators for us to understand whether the law on the protection of whistleblowers, and in this particular case, the law on the protection of whistleblowers in Lithuania, actually works. Because I would imagine that you can agree that the success is not defined only by the fact of having the law. The real question is, how is the law applied? And in this particular case, again, the success cannot be defined by the number of whistleblowers speaking up. Probably we should be looking at how well the law is actually being transposed into every single environment that needs to make sure that people reporting about instances of corruption are protected. So we started doing this work about 7 years ago, because as a matter of fact, we were one of the main proponents on the law of the protection of whistleblowers here in Lithuania for the past 10 years. And we're very happy to have the law finally. And as I mentioned, I think it's quite a good law. What we realized about 7 years ago is that even if you would speak about basic provisions outside of the whistleblowers domain, outside of the conversation, what it takes to protect whistleblowers or reporting individuals in a proper manner, you would see that a lot of institutions actually would not have proper channels in place. They would not know what data security is all about. For instance, just a few years ago, we ran a study on our municipalities, and we realized that actually every fourth municipality would encourage relatively insecure reporting, and a lot of data would be available to individuals that should not have access to that data if you were to make a report. Just before the final push for the law on the protection of whistleblowers here in Vilnius, we did a study on the public sector and looked at how well public sector institutions actually dealt with the issue of reporting, whether they informed their employees in a proper manner. And what we realized is that 1/3 of those institutions encouraged their employees to report corruption. However, again, it was not clear how their personal data was handled. A lot of those institutions did not have a separate reporting channel and asked individuals to report via any means possible. And that really duplicated the data that we had before on our public sector. And that was that we really had an issue with just basic handling of reports. And anybody who would report a potential misconduct actually run a risk of their identity being disclosed to people who could have heard them, could have actually try to influence their acts further on, their decisions, people who actually could decide on the livelihood of those individuals reporting potential acts of corruption. And that, of course, goes to the core of whether the law on the protection of whistleblowers can effectively work or not, and whether those people who report acts of potential corruption actually can feel safe, and whether they really address the issue the way we would expect them to. So in this particular case, of course, you can ask, well, is this the case all across the board? Maybe you're looking at the public sector, and maybe actually there's no issue whatsoever if you speak about the outcomes of this at play. And what we see actually is that people in Lithuania don't really rush to inform the authorities about corruption. This is the data from the Lithuanian map of corruption, a quantitative survey that we have in Lithuania. It's conducted on the annual basis now, and it's a great instrument managed by our colleagues at the Anti-Corruption Agency here, the Special Investigation Service, to understand where we're going in terms of anti-corruption measures. And what you see here is that while people are increasingly informed about where to report corruption, they hesitate to do so. In this particular case, this is the slide representing the responses of business people. And it's quite worrisome because you see that it's not only about reporting corruption, it's also about finding a way or understanding how you can take part in anti-corruption initiatives. Now, it doesn't mean that we're failing. What it can, and I think what it actually does mean, is that people increasingly delegate the responsibility of anything related to anti-corruption to law enforcement institutions, particular public bodies, non-governmental organizations, and don't necessarily see their role in taking a stand against a particular misconduct. So perhaps, in a way, we as the society are maturing, but I would maintain that this is also an issue. And that issue goes to the core of what we just discussed in the beginning of my presentation. I think that when we campaign for the law on the protection of whistleblowers, and when we speak about the protection of whistleblowers, many of us realize that this is one key element, if not a silver bullet, to actually shake up the systems of nepotism that we often have at display in our institutions. And I'm not saying our institutions are predominantly corrupt. I'm just saying that a lot of times the only way to know about certain arrangements within a particular organization is to have an insider speak up about that. And the only way to prevent that situation from taking place is for people in power to know that if they were to misbehave, somebody within the organization could speak up and could actually raise those issues publicly. So my argument here would be that for any good manager, any good CEO who comes in and actually decides to make their organization a success story, it's essential to speak to their employees and make sure that their employees can raise various concerns, that the brass of that organization actually knows the pulse of what's going on within the workplace. And if there is a red flag, they would be the first ones to actually understand what action needs to be taken. And they wouldn't learn about it from the Prosecutor General's office, as it would be the case here in Lithuania, or some other whistleblowers protection authority. So that is why I have this number on this screen. As you know, in Lithuania, soon it will be almost 2 years that we have the law on whistleblowing. But we don't really know yet how well that law is implemented. All we know is that the Prosecutor General, as you, I'm sure, have heard yesterday, deals with quite a number of cases, surprisingly a large number of cases, I think, for a country like ours, and perhaps does so quite successfully. But what I'm happy about is that we, together with our colleagues at the Prosecutor Generals, agreed that the true success is not the number of cases reported, but the number of institutions that have managed to install proper, safe reporting channels has a growing culture of trust within their own organizations. So the number 118 actually is the number of institutions that we just sent out our surveys, our questionnaires to, asking precisely that. And within the few next weeks, we should get the responses back. The goal is to have a proper understanding of how our largest public sector institutions have managed to implement the law, whether they have safe hotlines in place, whether they have professional staff allocated to those reporting channels, whether that staff is relatively well trained and taken care of financially, whether our institutions actually understand how many people have used their internal reporting channels and what those instances reported were, because the goal really is to make sure, as I mentioned, that heads of our institutions understand that the anti-corruption or good governance element within the law on the protection of whistleblowers is really in their hands as well. And of course, we understand that it's not just about surveys. So what we decided we do with our colleagues at the Prosecutor Generals and the Special Investigation Service is that we would start building a community of good practice. And now every year, just like you, I suppose, we will be holding a whistleblower protection forum. I expect it to take place again for the second time upcoming February. And what I'm really happy about is that at a gathering like this, people speak up, but speak up now about questions and challenges that they have and ask questions how to implement certain provisions better. And I'm also very happy that our Prosecutor General's office has, I think, embraced the role not only of the investigator and the prosecutor, which I would imagine comes much more naturally to them, but also that one of advisor and a teacher and a listener, because clearly it's a very new phenomenon for all of us, and we're not sure how to answer certain questions. However, what we are sure about is that when we speak about safe reporting and effective reporting and proper protection of whistleblowers, we speak about practical guidelines that the Prosecutor General Office has to provide to all institutions in place. Legal support sometimes needs to be there for those institutions to take proper action. We do need to make sure that confidentiality is ensured when we speak about any kind of reporting channels. And it is essential for people who consider reporting to know that they actually can be protected at their workplace, not by somebody from the outside, somebody like the Prosecutor General's office. We also understand that it's key that there's a need for protection against legal action, but that goes without saying nowadays, I think. And yet, what I also would like to stress is the last 2 points, and that is, I think in Lithuania, we realize now that it's also essential to have well-trained staff working not only at the Prosecutor Generals and any other institution within any other country responsible for the protection of whistleblowers legislation, but also within the institutions that have hotlines in place. And finally, what is key is empathy at the workplace, because what we realize time and again, speaking to different organizations employees working in very large public sector institutions and private sector businesses, is that a lot of times misunderstandings occur and people don't speak up about particular issues that could be easily sorted out because they do not feel connected to the environment within the organization that they work in. They do not think that somebody would want to listen to them and hear what they have to say. And that is why empathy, just taking a moment and asking a question or making yourself available, I think is something which is so easily overlooked and yet so powerful when we think of the grease or sort of the oil that would work, that would help the machinery of any whistleblower protection narrative work. And that is why I would very much like to stress that as my last point as to what is needed in place to ensure effective and successful reporting. That is it from me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. I understand that we still have a few minutes left. And just to make it easier, I will stop the screen share.
Thank you, Sergejus, for driving us into the next level. Yes, our listeners have some questions for you, and one of them is Lithuania is the only European Union country which have compensation mechanism for whistleblowers. How would you rate the effectiveness of this support mechanism, and whether you would invite other member states to follow the example, and why?
So this is a good question. I don't know if you discussed this yesterday with Monica and Dintara. We have had a couple of cases now people being compensated. I think these cases took place this year. If you'd ask me, I think that at the end of the day, this is not the most vital element for the whistleblowers protection framework, to be successful. It must be an important bonus, but I think first and foremost, it's essential to ensure that you have proper procedures in place and that there are no misunderstandings as to how such compensation would be given out. And again, I would like to stress that in my view, any kind of compensation is just a side effect or sort of a side occurrence, rather, when we speak about all the other challenges and issues that a whistleblower clearly has to deal with. And that is potential relocation if they blow the whistle in a small place and cannot find a job, challenges, psychological threats, physical threats, other challenges to them and their family. So I think if there's a possibility to have compensation, I would suggest one seriously considers this as a part of their legal framework. If there are people opposing it for a particular reason within lawmakers' community, this is something which can be discussed later as well. That is not something which one has to sort of focus on, and it's not something that has to stall the progress if you want to have a law in place.
We have a few minutes left, therefore one more question. If you could comment on, are there conditions for submitting an alert report in Lithuania? How much proof of violation need to be provided? How much evidence required, or probability it's sufficient?
Right, so that's a good question, and that's the question first and foremost to my colleagues at the Prosecutor General Office, of course. I'm happy that the law states that you don't need to be overly bureaucratic in filing a report. Just write it up the way you know it, and that has to be taken into consideration.
Thank you again. Sergejus, thank you very much for presentation and answers to our questions. Klaus